Hey all, hope you're well. So I haven't done a video in a while, so I thought, well, let me do a video because if I have to type this, it's going to take forever. This morning while on my training ride, one of the cyclists said to me, so what do you think about the IF, intermittent fasting diet, the 16 8-hour window period? And I said to him, well, what are your goals? And his response to me was his goal is to lose weight. So I said to him, okay, well, that's great. I said, have you lost weight? And he said, yes, I've lost 2 kilograms. He's lost 2 kilograms in 2 months. And I said to him, well, the only reason you're losing weight on IF is because you're eating in a calorie deficit. So as opposed to eating throughout the entire day, he's eating in an 8-hour window period. And because of that, there's a reduction in calorie intake through the course of the day, probably because of a smaller gap in his eating time. And what's happening then is ultimately it's resulting in a calorie deficit, which is causing his weight loss. But in order to lose weight, you only have to eat in a calorie deficit. So is intermittent fasting the answer? Well, no, it's not, because you can eat a high carbohydrate diet. You can go on a keto diet. You can go on any diet that you ever want to go on. And the bottom line is every single one of these diets have one thing in common: calorie deficit. It doesn't make a difference what you do. If you want to lose weight, you need to eat in a calorie deficit. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I said, well, why are you training? And this now is where the discussion becomes quite interesting. Well, I'm training because I've got a half Ironman event in, I think it's 2.5 months. And I'm like, okay, well, then you shouldn't be fasting right now. And he's like, well, why? I want to lose weight. I'm like, yeah, but you're doing an event. And he's like, okay. And I'm like, well, because you're doing an event and you're fasting, you actually are limiting your ability to perform in that event and to actually get stronger and fitter over a shorter period of time so that you can get to that event in the best possible shape. Why? Because if you want to improve training adaptations and you want to have good power numbers, good pace numbers, and good speed, you need to eat. You actually need to eat. You can't be fasting. Fasting will limit your ability to recover from session to session, which will lower the training adaptation. Number 2, not consuming anything when you're doing quality sessions will lower your power numbers, lower your pace numbers. It will not allow you to perform at the level that you should be performing, and it will lower your training adaptations. So you need to try and find a balance between maximizing your energy levels when required and trying to get into shape. So the first thing this says to me is, well, you can't be eating in too much of a calorie deficit. You should rather be eating in a very slight calorie deficit over a much longer period of time and let the weight loss drop gradually over a longer period of time, but focus on your ability to perform. And you will burn off more calories if you perform at a high level anyway. And focus on improving your fitness, improving your strength, improving your power, improving your pace. You need to be able to feed. You need to be able to feed. You can't be starving yourself. I always say this: the harder you train, the harder you have to eat. And you cannot ever forget that. Because when you're putting the body under stress and you're training, the body requires nutrients to be able to perform under all conditions that you're putting it under. So, I mean, if you're putting it under severe stress, which is endurance exercise, which is strength exercise, which is, it doesn't matter what you're doing, you need to feed it to be able to allow it to have the energy it requires for you to be able to perform, as well as the nutrients that are required to help the body recover. And it's not just recovery from a muscle point of view. We're talking about immune system, we're talking about muscle protein synthesis, we're talking about glycogen replenishment, we're talking about rehydration, we're talking about a whole lot of different recovery strategies that are required. Fasting is not going to achieve that. That's crazy. So you need to decide, what is your main goal? An athlete, fasting is not a great way to do things. Now, something that I do recommend, and I'm not saying that I'm against intermittent fasting, is that you can pick certain days of the week to do an intermittent fast on that particular day if you really want to. And I would pick days which are actually probably toned down more aerobic sessions where you don't need to focus as much on the recovery aspects as you would need to when you're putting in a quality session. So when you are doing quality work, that's where you're going to have to give the body a lot more focus on recovery and energy. And on days where you're doing very light or short aerobic sessions, you can afford to obviously eat less because you're burning off less calories, and you can probably achieve what you want to in those winter periods. Another problem with intermittent fasting is if you have got a high protein intake, it's very difficult to actually hit those targets in that very small window, because we know that protein can only be absorbed in certain quantities over a certain period of time. And in my case, sometimes I hit 180 grams of protein a day. It's impossible for me to fit that in 8 hours. It will never happen, because protein basically can be absorbed at rates of, let's say, maybe 30 grams every 2.5 to 3 hours. So 180, divide that by 30, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So that's just an example of where intermittent fasting can fit in, and if it's ready for weight loss, there are other ways to do that. It's calorie deficit, calorie deficit, calorie deficit. We'll chat again soon.